morning to everybody in London and also to everybody joining us online. My name is Brent Mittelstadt. I am a professor of data ethics and policy at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. And I'm delighted to be able to join you today to talk to you about the problem of hallucinations in large language models and what we can do about them. So this talk today is based on a couple of recent papers that I published. One which recently came out in Royal Society Open Science called Do Large Language Models Have a Legal Duty to Tell the Truth? And the second, which came out last year in Nature Human Behavior, called To Protect Science, We Must Use Language Models as Zero-Shot Translators. Essentially, in both papers, what I'm looking at is the problem that we face with language models like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Llama from Meta, where they don't always get things right. When they are asked questions of fact, quite often they get small facts wrong, or they may be completely wrong. They may be, create things, invent things entirely. Basically, the problem is that they cannot fundamentally distinguish between fact and fiction, and so they can end up misleading users. So let's look at a couple of examples of hallucinations just to set the scene here. This is one taken recently from the Google AI previews that they say are experimental, based on Gemini, where somebody was asking just for food names that end with UM, and suddenly the chatbot invented a bunch of fruits that don't actually exist, and for some reason thought that coconut ended in UM. I decided to try to recreate this to see if it's still happening, a couple weeks after this originally came out. And weirdly enough, it's not inventing fruit names anymore, but it's giving words that have absolutely nothing to do with food, like quantum, medium, spectrum, and so forth. So a different sort of hallucination, but still clearly getting things wrong and not understanding the question being asked. I also did some testing again with Google, asking it, what volcanoes do we have in England? Got some interesting answers. Google confidently told me that we have a number of volcanoes extinct, but also some active volcanoes, which was surprising. When I clicked the Show More button, it told me what some of those volcanoes are. I was surprised to find that 2 active volcanoes were listed, one of which is not actually in England. Mount Snowdon, as far as I know, is in Wales. But apparently it is an active volcano, which might come as a surprise to the residents of Wales. So I decided to just double check with Google and say, are you sure about that, essentially? What active volcanoes do we have in England? And then it confidently told me, and correctly in this case, that actually England does not have any active volcanoes. So depending on what you ask Gemini in this case, it will give you very different answers, and it will directly contradict itself within the space of 2 questions. I think it's also interesting to think about where hallucinations come from. So why it is that language models can't tell fact from fiction. And I think the easiest way to think of them is essentially as very large autocomplete models, very complex autocomplete models. But essentially, they're just trying to predict the next most likely string of text within a sentence. And sometimes that text or that string of words is correct, but sometimes it's not. And there was this really interesting example on Twitter from David Smearden that was looking at a common problem with language models, which is when they invent academic references or academic papers. So he asked, in this case, ChatGPT, what is the most cited economics paper of all time? Got this answer back that was very confident sounding. The most cited economics paper of all time is A Theory of Economic History by Douglas North and Robert Thomas. It even has the year of publication, the journal that it was published in. So this all sounds very reasonable. It has a lot of detail to it. So at least at first glance, it looks correct. But if you actually search for that paper, it doesn't exist. And so then the question, of course, becomes, well, how did that happen? Why is it inventing these sorts of things? And I think there's actually a fairly intuitive and reasonable explanation that was given in this thread. One is that ChatGPT can't read academic articles correctly, but it can look at resources, or it has resources like Wikipedia in its training data that discuss academic research. And so from that, it may be able to determine that the most commonly used words in the titles of highly cited economics papers are economics and theory. And that is reflected in this research that was looking again at the most common words within highly cited economics papers. And that's what these word clouds are. They're essentially showing what the most common terms are. So it turns out that papers with those 2 words also commonly have the word history in the title. So that gets us most of the way there to the title of our fake paper, A Theory of Economic History. But then if you wanted to guess who might be the author of the most highly cited paper in economics of all time, well, a good guess would be Douglas C. North, who is the most cited economics professor of all time, according to Google Scholar, also a Nobel laureate. So it seems reasonable, or intuitive at least. It's a good guess, in other words, that he would be the author of the most cited economics paper of all time. But from looking at Wikipedia, ChatGPT could also potentially see that highly cited papers tend to have 2 authors. So who would be a good second author for the paper? Well, why not somebody that Douglas C. North has actually published with in the past, Robert Paul Thomas? They wrote this book together that, interestingly, has a very, very similar title to the paper that was made up. So again, that seems like a pretty good guess, and that gets us most of the way to this invention that ChatGPT has created. But while this is a relatively sort of low impact invention, it is worth remembering that these sorts of hallucinations can have very significant impacts on people. As a lawyer in New York found out not too long ago, a lawyer used ChatGPT to prepare a brief, presented the brief in court. The brief cited fake cases, and the lawyer was sanctioned as a result. In fact, they were eventually disbarred, citing a failure of professional ethics and living up to the fiduciary duties that lawyers have to clients. So again, the hallucinations can have very, very significant consequences. So the question naturally becomes, what can you actually do to combat hallucinations? Or maybe more simply, what is it that the companies, the providers that are building these models and these applications, what are they doing to combat hallucinations? Well, if you look at the terms and conditions or like the FAQ pages, the user documentation basically for some of the more popular ones, you will find statements that show that, contrary to sort of public belief, contrary to the marketing surrounding these applications, that actually they get things wrong quite often. So it's noted, for example, that ChatGPT may produce inaccurate information about people, places, or facts. Bard, which was the precursor to Gemini, is cited as an experiment. It may give inaccurate or inappropriate results. And you can see similar things with Bing that was running ChatGPT-4, Llama 2. And you'll see these sorts of statements with most of the popular language models that are publicly accessible. And if you look at where these statements actually are on the page, aside from those FAQ pages, sometimes you'll get these small statements at the bottom of the page where it says ChatGPT can make mistakes, consider checking important information. This one was for Copilot. If you go into the FAQ, there's a question there about whether the responses are always factual. And again, there Microsoft admits, or OpenAI admits, that it's not always accurate. It's relying on data from the internet, so it may not always get things right. Gemini as well has a very small statement at the bottom, which you can barely read here, but it says Gemini may display inaccurate info, including about people, so double check the responses. All of this is basically to say that it is the responsibility of the user to actually check the factual, whether the statements are correct or not. Basically, do your own research, do some sort of double checking. And in Gemini now, there's even a button where essentially you can tell Gemini to retrieve results from Google to double check whether it got things right. So that's going some way to combating hallucinations. I mean, again, you are just sort of doubling down on relying on the internet and Google search results in this case as a reliable source of information. I won't go into that. You can draw your own conclusions on that. But again, the onus essentially falls on the user to double check things to make sure that things are right. The law doesn't do much. I should say the AI Act that was recently was passed, will come into force before too long, doesn't do a great deal to combat hallucinations. So there are some notification duties in there for these sorts of models that you need to be informed that you're interacting with an AI system, and the outputs of AI systems need to be marked as generated or as artificially generated. So that's sort of watermarking, and that is a notification duty. It's nice to have that. It's important to have that. But knowing that something is artificially generated isn't necessarily going to help you detect whether it's correct or not. You need to already be skeptical or informed on the topic in order to be able to make that distinction. And so I want to talk not just about hallucinations, but about what we talk about in the paper, which is this new concept of careless speech. You can compare hallucinations to careless speech in the sense of careless speech is much more subtle. So quite often hallucinations are very obvious, things like volcanoes that are clearly not active or are not in the country that they actually are stated to be in. Whereas careless speech would be just speech that lacks appropriate care for truth. And I'm referring to the outputs of language models as speech in this case. So careless speech would be any output generated by a language model in response to a prompt that has some question of fact involved. Where the response is presented as authoritative, objective, or factually correct, despite suffering from one or more of these deficiencies that we list here, which could just be that the statement contains factual inaccuracies or inventions. It could be that the response includes references to sources, but the sources are non-representative, not up to date. It could be that the response is incomplete in some way, so it's only giving you partial truth. Could be the response lacks sort of signifiers of uncertainty, so how confident the system is in its output, which again, not all language models, most of them cannot do that. It may be that it lacks references entirely to source material to say where the information comes from, or in some cases, the references are not actually based on the referred text. So in other words, the references are being used incorrectly. Or it could just be that the summaries are in some way inaccurate. We go into each of those sort of deficiencies much more in the paper, but I won't go into them further today. So the key thing is careless speech is distinct from hallucinations in terms of how hard it is to detect and thus how hard it is to fix. So hallucinations can often be identified by non-expert users or data annotators. They don't require any specific expertise to actually detect and know that they're wrong, whereas careless speech requires some sort of pre-existing expertise, some sort of domain expertise in order to detect. So these are subtle inaccuracies. They are things that are hard to detect as incorrect when you're looking at the output of these systems. And the language models we have today are very much built on what's called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF. And that's where you can see a lot of hallucinations, a lot of the obvious ones getting picked up by the human annotators or the data annotators. And just to quickly say how RLHF works, essentially you have a prompt given to the language model, produces a bunch of responses. Those responses are then given to a human annotator that ranks them or gives some sort of feedback on them. And then that feedback is used to train a reward model, basically to improve the outputs of the language model going forward. So an example of that would be if we ask a prompt about, tell me something about the first moon landing. We get these 4 responses. They get ranked by the human annotator in this order. And they seem fine, or at least the first couple seem fine at first glance. It's telling you when the first moon landing occurred. Apollo 11 was the mission involved. The 4th one is, the moon landing was a hoax staged by NASA on behalf of the American government. Probably not going to get ranked highly depending on who the human annotator is. But the important thing here is, whereas you might see response 4 as an obvious hallucination, something that is clearly incorrect, there's also a subtle inaccuracy in response 3, which you may or may not have seen, which is that the first moon landing was the subject of a Hollywood film starring Tom Hanks. That's not correct. The film was not about the Apollo 11 mission. It was about the Apollo 13 mission, which clearly went wrong. And so if you haven't seen that movie before, then you wouldn't be able to detect that is incorrect, and you could end up being misinformed about that. A more sort of serious example of that would be, let's say we want to learn something about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. We can ask ChatGPT for a 2-paragraph summary of it. ChatGPT gives us a summary of it, which contains a subtle inaccuracy. And the subtle inaccuracy here is that organizations require explicit consent in order to process personal data. That's not true. There's actually a lot of legal bases that you can use as an organization to process personal data. So if you were to ask ChatGPT this and take it at its word, you would end up falsely believing that explicit consent is required. Just as a sort of fun example here, I asked ChatGPT to write a short biography of me, describing where I grew up in the style of a pirate. It does a good job with the pirate language, I think, but it says that I was born in the moors of England. You can probably tell from my accent that's not correct. Where I was born is not public knowledge, or at least it wasn't before I started giving these talks. And so again, just here, ChatGPT has gotten something wrong, but unless you know where I was born, you would not know that. You would not be able to detect that up front because that information was not part of its training data. So those are just some examples of careless speech. I should say watermarking and referencing are not really silver bullet solutions to careless speech. Just one example of that would be we asked Bing about Boris Johnson, why Boris Johnson was indicted. Gave us a very confident answer about how Boris Johnson was indicted on 37 counts of various crimes related to his conduct as prime minister. It gives us a date. It even gives us references. So it gives us links to basically check the information ourselves. And they're to good sources. They're to Financial Times, to the BBC, and there's a couple more that are high quality sources. So you look at this and think, oh, there's sources, there's references, great. It must know what it's talking about. But if you click through onto the Financial Times link, what you'll see is that actually it's completely wrong. Boris Johnson was not indicted. Rather, it was Donald Trump that was indicted and charged with 37 counts. So it just so happens that the link that is being, or the reference that's being used here, is to a news feed that contains multiple stories. And so it's very easy to sort of mix up or not be able to see that the 37 counts refer to Donald Trump and not to Boris Johnson, especially when the text appears so close to each other. And I have some sympathy for ChatGPT for confusing Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, but at the same time, it's giving you a link to the Financial Times, which you will probably think is a reliable source, and yet it is fundamentally getting things wrong here. So referencing is not a silver bullet to solve this problem. I should just say quickly, too, that this notion of careless speech, because quite often we get asked, but what is true? What is truth anyway? And we're not making a claim about sort of what truth is. So we're not sort of saying positivism is the correct account of truth or anything like that. Rather, we're looking at how we decide what is true. So we're looking at how, when people sort of debate with each other, when they form beliefs, when they try to have a discussion about the truth of something, what is it that they're trying to do? What do the claims look like? What does the nature of the discussion look like? And basically, is ChatGPT showing sort of appropriate care for truthfulness, for objectivity, for representativeness? Is it, in other words, fulfilling the role that a person would fill if they were trying to be responsible and talk about something that is true or false? There's a number of harms that can come from careless speech. Many of them are immaterial, they're collective, they're societal. Essentially, careless speech causes harms that have a very long tail. They can be very hard to notice. They would be cumulative. It can be about basic things like just eroding common knowledge or shared social truth over time. And that makes it really hard to actually regulate careless speech or to regulate truth and language models because the law as it currently exists only regulates what you could call acute speech harms or short or severe speech harms. So these would be harms that speech causes to physical or psychological well-being, reputation, so things like libel and defamation law. Could be about privacy and data protection. Could be about toxic or hate speech, so through equality and non-discrimination law. Or it could be about public safety. So, the classic case of yelling fire in a crowded theater, that would be a sort of speech harm that the law would actually regulate. So what it appears is that careless speech kind of falls through the cracks. It doesn't quite fit into any of the legal frameworks we currently have, which just seems problematic because of these longer term harms that you could see resulting from widespread usage of language models. And it's something that you have to study in the longer term to see how these harms actually manifest. But I think we can posit them now and observe what happens over time. And I think one of the biggest risks we have is that really language models, because they're based on the likelihood of text, you get this sort of common token bias. You get this consensus-based or crowdsourced version of the truth that's very heavily sanitized, subjective, it's consensus-based. And typically we don't think that truth is based on, solely at least on consensus. That it's not going to be based on how often a statement is repeated in an online forum, for example, but rather there's going to be some basis in empirical fact or argumentation or knowledge or the scientific method or something like that. So we have this very weird, I think, new form of truth that is entirely crowdsourced or consensus based. And I think you can have this harm of sort of rewriting history through a couple of different mechanisms. One is that there's a clear risk that sort of majority accounts or widely accepted accounts of, say, historical or scientific fact will be disseminated more frequently and will be reinforced over time at a cost to minority accounts. And that sort of reinforcement of majority accounts can be exacerbated through recursion, which I'll talk about more in just a second. You also have the problem of fine-tuning to hide toxic content. So you see a lot of guardrails being erected for these models that are designed to prevent them from discussing certain topics. And while in some cases that may be appropriate, it can also be that you end up sort of cutting certain topics out of the public discourse. And it becomes this sort of harm that actually has a historical precedent where essentially what you're doing is erasing someone, be it an individual or a group of people, from history. And that is seen as a very, very severe harm to a person, to their likeness, to their reputation, and something I think we should be taking very seriously in terms of demanding transparency around how guardrails are erected, what topics or prompts are considered off the table or not appropriate for these models to engage with. You also have a harm related to the propagation of errors by these systems. What we might see is a crowding out of human-generated speech in online spaces by using language models to produce essentially filler text, or what would be called astroturfing, so just spreading sort of specific messages widely. We're already seeing the filler text problem and the astroturfing problem emerge. So if you go onto Twitter, for example, and you search for the sort of classic phrase that you would get when ChatGPT doesn't want to give you an answer, where it talks about a answer or topic or response being against OpenAI's use case policy. If you search for that on Twitter, you'll see lots of accounts that are tweeting that. Which would suggest that these are bot accounts essentially that are being run with ChatGPT. You can also see, with the sort of propagation of errors, real world consequences. So with Copilot, with language models used for coding purposes, there's been a case of basically software packages that were originally hallucinated by one of these models, then being created by people and basically creating malware. And because the code that's produced by Copilot or by language models makes reference or calls to these imaginary libraries, once they exist, that's a very, very easy way to spread malware, or it's a new sort of vector of attack. It presents a cybersecurity risk. And we may see this propagation of errors lead to what's called model collapse over time due to recursion. Basically, when language models start to train on their own data, any errors that existed in the first round or in the original training data could just be repeated over time and become sort of the majority view. which could lead to all sorts of problems which have been discussed elsewhere. And there's actually a really interesting example of that, which has to do with the Scots language, where essentially there's a Wikipedia page on the Scots language that was prepared by a high school student in the US that doesn't actually speak Scots. That is the primary source of Scots language that appears to be used by ChatGPT, at least. And so you get this, if you ask for a response related to the Scots language or something to be produced in the Scots language, you get responses that are not in that language. They're in sort of this version of English that appears to just have a Scottish accent appended to it, which is completely incorrect because the Wikipedia page was essentially satirical. But of course, these models can't actually distinguish between things that are satirical and responsible or objective. So in the article, we also look at whether the providers of these models could be compelled to create models that tell the truth. We ask a number of questions like who could actually hold that duty to tell the truth? Where do those duties exist in international law? Are there general duties? Are they more sector specific and limited? Could you create some sort of general duty to tell the truth to compel a company like OpenAI to create models that consistently tell the truth or produce truthful responses? We looked at the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We looked at the Convention on Human Rights, jurisprudence that relate to these things. We looked at the Court of Justice and also the European Court of Human Rights, basically to figure out whether truth duties actually exist in human rights law as a starting point to try to compel companies to actually create models that tell the truth. We looked at a number of fundamental rights where we thought a duty to tell the truth or be honest or just otherwise be responsible in speech may exist. So we're looking at freedom of expression and information, freedom of science and academia, the right to education in schools, and economic rights and duties. And what we found was that the law doesn't do much. There's not much in the way of general duties. Also, there are some sector-specific duties, but they are very limited in scope. So essentially, the law does very little to regulate truth, which in many cases is completely appropriate, but it's also surprising to find that there's no sort of legal commitment to truth in the context of science, academia, education, and schools. It may be that you can find those things in national law or in more sort of focused sectoral law. We're looking in those areas now to see if anything can be found, but our initial analysis was not particularly promising. But please do look at the full paper for the full analysis here. And just to very briefly mention solutions. So I already mentioned watermarking, referencing are not silver bullets. Some companies are looking at including confidence or uncertainty signals in the responses produced by systems. Perplexity AI is one that's doing that with references, for example. What we propose is to use something called zero-shot translation to minimize hallucinations and careless speech. This is a really simple idea, really simple thing to do. Essentially, it's a restriction on how you as a user would use these models, so that what sort of tasks you would give them or what sort of prompts you would give them. Essentially, what we're saying is if you're asking one of these models a question of fact, don't look at it as a reliable general source of knowledge. Rather, look at it as something that can translate reliable information you provide to it into some new form or into some new domain. So you prompt the models for translations in order to reduce the chance of hallucinations occurring. So just an example of that from before when we were talking about the GDPR, what we could do is instead of asking it for a 2-paragraph summary about the general data protection regulation, instead we would ask it to convert a list of facts about the GDPR into a 2-paragraph summary. So here we have sourced the facts about the GDPR from the Information Commissioner's Office, so they should be reliable. And when we do that, when we give it some good source material to translate, it ends up getting things right. It doesn't make the same mistake that it did in the original one. It doesn't say that explicit consent is required. So that's one way to fix things. We can do that with the biography too. Again, my biography about being born in England, which was incorrect. If instead I tell ChatGPT that I was born in Iowa and give it a bio, the bio is much more accurate, and of course it gets my place of birth correct. This is, again, a very simple example of translation. But you can do it with more complex things like writing code to plot out data, where you would basically give it good information and ask it just to give you some code that could actually plot it. And this is a way to reduce hallucinations, but actually it's not perfect because even in this case, ChatGPT got things wrong. Not all of our data points were included on the resulting graph. So even there, we had to go back and tell it, hey, you got this wrong. Please include all of the data in the resulting graph. Once we did that, we got things right. So just to conclude, I think that fixing the problem of hallucinations is really, really important. Fixing the problem of careless speech is really important. I think there's a real risk of these systems undermining common knowledge and shared social reality, shared social truths. I think we should compel language models to cite their sources, to include references, to ideally have some sort of uncertainty measures or confidence measures included with responses. We think that also companies have a responsibility to reveal what their training data is and the influence of different sources on the models. So, is Wikipedia the most commonly cited source, for example? Just so we can actually, do research and measure over time the impact that language models have on our beliefs as individuals and also as societies. So, thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions in the online Q&A forum. And yes, thank you again. And yes, look forward to your questions.